following months and years after Katrina, you were reminded of that storm every single day. And it was really years until we were no longer reminded on a daily basis of just how bad it was and what we had all gone through. I mean, it was definitely a mental health concern as well here, because it drained on you. And this wasn't one of those storms where it moves in, it moves out, it passes. A couple of days later, you've cleaned up your front lawn and you're back to normal and you've completely forgotten about it, which has really been our history since the 60s with hurricanes. And now here we have Katrina, which then we're kind of reminded of on a daily basis for many years of just what we went through.
Chris, your story, the personal part of your story that stands out, it's so much like so many other people's story that have a deep connection with New Orleans. They want to be there, but then there's this upheaval and this period of uncertainty of I'm leaving. I don't know for how long. I want to come back. It could be weeks. It could be months. It could be longer. It sounds like you got back after Thanksgiving that year. Then you continued to provide weather coverage for the city beyond that. Did you find other meteorologists, other news journalism people, were there many that left and never came back?
A lot. And most of the ones that did, I don't think were, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head how many of them had left. There weren't a lot that were local. May have been a couple that just had and there were that, but beyond the journalism news group, there were a lot of people that evacuated to Atlanta, Houston, and still to this day that was a Katrina baby. We evacuated, born in New Orleans, but we stayed in Houston, and they grew up in Houston, and we consider ourselves Houstons, but we still have that New Orleans connection. So there were still definitely a lot of folks that just couldn't handle coming back. And to be honest, there are a lot of folks that just don't have the means of coming back. Whatever they were able to collect in insurance and whatnot, they were able to make a life for themselves outside of New Orleans, and they knew trying to come back and rebuild their home would have just been too cost prohibitive, and they did stay away. But we definitely saw a decline. I mean, we've seen a decline in just our population in general. So definitely in our smaller news community, there were a lot of folks that left just after what we saw, what we experienced, and they just couldn't imagine handling it. Now, I will say, at the age now of 40 with my family and 2 young kids, if I had gone through Katrina now and having lost my home, it may have been, I don't know, it may be tough to say, yeah, let's rebuild everything and let's start over from scratch. I don't know. As a 23-year-old with an apartment that I'm renting and no real personal responsibility at that age, it was easy. Yeah, I'm going to stay. My apartment was fine. Wasn't that bad. I can sleep on a floor somewhere for months on end, and I can work in a drafty building for a while and use the bathroom outside. It's not a big deal. But, some of the older folks, they did or kind of used that opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I think this is a great time to retire. This was my cornerstone type storm or my pinnacle, and I think I'm good. I'm done here. So we definitely saw some of that.
For sure. And then, when you have kids in the mix, a lot of times people say, well, I want to stay, but my kids need to be in school. And, we could go and live near family and they could be in school next week, right? If we stay in the city. I mean, that just, it really shook everything up for really months to years, right?
All of my brothers were, I'm the oldest of the 4 boys, and all of my brothers were in school at the time, and their schools all flooded. Where we went to high school is in Gentilly. It flooded, Brother Martin. And so for a time, my brothers were at school in Baton Rouge. And then when we finally did come back to New Orleans, they had what was called a transitional school, and the Archdiocese of New Orleans, we went to Catholic school, set up satellite schools at the other schools that weren't flooded, mainly in Jefferson Parish. And so they would go to school in the morning, and the students of that school would then go to school that evening and night. So it would almost be a 18-hour school day for one half of the school, and then the other half of the school, we all went to either all male or all female schools down in New Orleans, and so they were mixing the genders as well. It was just basically, how do we get these kids in school and have somewhat of a normal year? But even now, it was, that they were the Katrina class. They graduated in Katrina, or they had their school year just completely screwed up by Katrina. And I was glad that I was already out of school, because I don't know if I would have been able to. And what's interesting is so many of the colleges then started doing remote classes.
Yeah.
And a lot of them stuck with that for a while. And, and it ended up turning out to where maybe it was we were ahead of the times, because then suddenly COVID, we were all doing remote everything. But in New Orleans, it was like, oh, yeah, I've done this before. This wasn't that bad at all. It's like, oh, I got to stay home and go to class. Yeah, I've already done this. This wasn't.
I've met a lot of people in Baton Rouge that say, yeah, I did my junior year of high school in Baton Rouge and then, went back to New Orleans. It just really, it just forced people to really have this, experience where they're uprooted and an upheaval in their life. When people move to the Gulf Coast, they often think the problem with hurricanes is the day of the storm. A tree is going to fall on you or you're going to be drowned in floodwater. For a lot of people, the day of the storm wasn't the worst part. It's the months and years afterwards that your whole life has been changed in an instant, right? Where you go to school, where you work, where you live.
And like we said, for most of our recent history before Katrina, it was just that. It was kind of a minor inconvenience. There were no upheavals of schools, upheavals of neighborhoods. It was an inconvenience for a couple of days. You had friends that, oh my God, yeah, they had a tree on their house.
It wasn't life altering.
Right. Yeah. And it wasn't the widespread life altering. And I think as of now, and it's what's been interesting about having been in New Orleans growing up before Katrina and then in the professional capacity after, people here take the storms far more seriously than we ever did before. And there is kind of that more lazy, casual way about New Orleans that you call me when it's a Cat 3, then maybe I'll be worried about it. Now, wait, there's a thunderstorm in the Gulf. Where is this going? How bad it's going to be? People are far more, maybe not worrisome, but they're far more, they pay more attention to these type of storms now, which they didn't before.
Chris, I wanted to ask you about that. I moved to the Gulf Coast to South Louisiana in 2008. I had been there less than a month, and here comes Hurricane Gustav. I was with the LSU hurricane team. We were going out to deploy sensors in the path of the storm. We went down I-10, and we get to the Gramercy exit. The cops are closing it not to protect us because there was contraflow. There were, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming out of Metro New Orleans, mandatory evacuation. The response was huge. This was a Cat 2 hurricane 3 years after Katrina. It sounds like you're saying the response to these storms post-Katrina was a lot different than maybe pre-Katrina.
No question. I think more folks, especially Gustav, where we're only 3 years removed, we were far more on edge. We were watching any and all threats because now New Orleans had seen what these storms could do. Prior to that, you have to go back to a generation when my parents were younger in Betsy, Camille more so, Betsy more so for New Orleans and then Camille more so for the Mississippi coast. But, it was a whole generation where we didn't really see what these storms could do. Katrina showed us we are vulnerable to the waters of the Gulf. We can see this water come surging in.
Sure.
We can see the winds rip apart the Superdome and rip apart some of the places that we thought we could evacuate to and be safe. And so I think a lot more folks were on edge. And certainly with Gustav, we took that storm more seriously. And I still think we are kind of being removed from that a little bit. But I think Ida was kind of that eye-opening experience that folks, we didn't enact any kind of evacuation. Ida was one of those unique storms. We talked about this at the hurricane conference, the tropical weather conference, that, we didn't get a whole lot of heads up. And maybe had we known a day earlier with Ida, maybe an evacuation would have been ordered and maybe would have gone through contraflow. But I know for me, people ask, well, what would you do? Or what would you do if you were me? And I said, well, I can't tell you what to do. What I can tell you is that I'm advising my family to evacuate.
Sure.
And so I think folks took that and said, okay, we're leaving. Because when I told my wife and kids, no, you need to go, other folks, that's what I said on air. I said, people want to know what to do. I'll tell you what I'm telling my family to do, and I'm telling them to leave. And so I think folks are taking these storms a little more seriously than maybe the more casual approach we had for decades before Katrina.
To catch our listeners up, a little bit of housekeeping here. Katrina was 2005. Gustav, Cat 2, made landfall out by Grand Isle in 2008. We had a storm Isaac, some big flood issues on the west end of Lake Pontchartrain and different areas in 2012, on the same day of Katrina's landfall, August 29th. And then also August 29th, 2021, Hurricane Ida. I want to talk a little bit about this with you now. We already touched base on it, but again, it was August 29th, 2021, that same date. Ida was different, though. It really blew up, rapidly intensified. I think the winds increased by 55 miles an hour in that last 24 hours. So it made landfall out by Grand Isle as a Cat 4. In parts of, I guess, the western part of Metro New Orleans, there were sustained hurricane force winds. Is that right?
Yes, what we call the river parishes. So that's a little bit beyond familiar with the geography of Orleans Parish, Jefferson Parish, that are right along the lakefront, although Jefferson Parish actually extends down to the coast and Grand Isle. Then as you continue westward, you have St. Charles, St. John, St. James Parish as you're headed toward Baton Rouge. And those are the river parishes. That's where the storm Ida passed right over, still as a weakening 3 to a 2. So you still had significant hurricane force winds in that area. And thankfully, the wind field was rather small. We did not have hurricane force sustained winds in Metro New Orleans from Jefferson Parish to Orleans. We had some damage, but we did not have the hurricane force winds. Storm surge and flooding wasn't as much of an issue with this because it was such a short duration storm from the time the genesis to landfall. Now, in that time, it was able to rapidly intensify. What we've kind of learned is that it takes longer for that storm surge to really build. And that was what the issue with Katrina was. It had a couple of days where it just sat off of the coast to build up that just record storm surge. So we did not have that in Ida, which is another reason why, and we could probably touch on this in a whole new other podcast, is why you can't compare storms, and each one is completely different.
Sure.
So yeah, but with Ida, it was kind of that, here we go again, off the Louisiana coast, a rapidly intensifying storm. I've done a few talks just about the short window from the time that it was just an invest to the time it's making landfall. And it was about 5 days, and it was about 2 to 3 days out. So you're looking at, 48 to 72 hours is when we finally had that more certainty that this is going to be a major hurricane at landfall. 4 to 5 days out, we mentioned it certainly is a possibility. Some of the models were indicating that. The Hurricane Center was still a little bit more conservative with that. But we were mentioning that it is certainly a possibility. The problem now is we may not get these huge days of a heads up if this is going to be a major hurricane at landfall. So, the city, the state may have to start issuing these evacuation orders, possibly just under the guise of it's a possibility. Maybe it's not a major hurricane right now, but it could be, or it's a high probability that it will be. And so we need to err on the assumption that it will be a major hurricane at landfall. Like with Katrina, we could see this becoming a 5, 3, 4 to a 5 off the coast. This is the time to leave now. With Ida, we didn't have that long window of opportunity to leave. So it was a quick storm. It was a rapidly intensifying storm. But as we were talking before, the forecast from the computer models and the National Hurricane Center are almost spot on. Once the models were really able to grab what Ida was going to do, they locked in on that Port Fourchon to Grand Isle landfall. They locked in on this intensifying right up to the point of landfall, and that is exactly what happened with the storm.
So it sounds like you're saying we didn't have the lead time with Ida that we did in a Katrina or some of these other storms where you have your 72-hour window or something like that. By the time it locked in, I'm thinking that's why they did not do the mandatory evacuation. They just probably felt like they didn't have time to get everyone out. Is that right?
Well, and I don't know if the talks were, the 42 hours of, well, yeah, the Hurricane Center and the forecasters are saying it might be a major hurricane, but we don't know for certain if it's going to be. So we're going to hold back on issuing a mandatory evacuation. Now, our lower lying areas, the areas near the coast and outside of our hurricane risk reduction system, the levee system, those were evacuated. But for the city itself, kind of look back on it, as I said, if we had had maybe one more day lead time, then perhaps we would have seen those mandatory evacuations issued. I do think, even without the mandatory evacuation issued, I still think a vast majority of our population, I've not seen the numbers of the estimates of how many actually evacuated, but I would say the majority of the city, more than 50% certainly, did evacuate from Ida. We didn't see, and Ida was completely different. With that said, Ida was completely different from Katrina, so we weren't getting reports of folks
Sure.
needing to be rescued, knowing who was still in the city. It was more of the inconvenience of folks saying, when are we going to get power back on? When are we going to get power back on? That was probably the biggest issue for Metro New Orleans. And then, of course, down the bayou as you get toward Houma to the coast and the river parishes, the main issue was that you had a major hurricane just pass right over you.
Chris, in the last 5 hurricane seasons, there have been 5 hurricanes that rapidly intensified in the last 24 hours before landfall. By that, I mean winds increased by at least 40 miles an hour in that last 24 hours. So we're seeing this, and all 5 of those were along the Gulf Coast. Has that changed, do you think, the way people are forecasting, communicating, or even responding to these storms?
Certainly, I think communicating and responding. I think we now, whereas maybe in the past we would be a little bit more hesitant on jumping onto the couple of computer models indicating that this could be a major hurricane. It may be something that, yeah, we'll see if more of the model runs are saying the same thing. We'll kind of back off on that for now. I'm trying to remember what storm it was. It may have been Laura, that when one of the first models was indicating a strengthening in the Gulf, that I kind of jumped on and said, no, this might be. And whereas maybe before I was maybe a bit more conservative with that,
Sure.
I think I'm starting to kind of highlight those possibilities sooner. And I do think residents here, with the means to evacuating is an expensive task.
Sure.
And not everyone can do it. But I think those that can, I think, are maybe heeding that warning a little bit more so than ever before. And as I said, our technology has gotten better. I will say, just watching this past weekend, Invest 98, the models did a fantastic job indicating it was not going to do much of anything right up to the coast of Texas. And just as it moved inland, it actually started to get that burst of convection near the center, and had this sat over the Gulf maybe another maybe 5 hours at minimum, we could have maybe seen this be named a depression just before moving inland. So the model, and I will say this was as of Friday, the models had been indicating that. So the computer model, the guidance, our technology is far superior than where we were back in 2005. And so the models and the meteorologists are much better with this. So I do think we've really stressed that. I think the public has seen that, not just with the tropics, but just in our daily forecasting. And so I think now when they see us mentioning 4 days out, hey, just want to let you know, this might not be the official forecast, and by official, what's coming in from the Hurricane Center, this is what the models are indicating. This does need to be taken seriously.
Chris, a few times you mentioned the word possibility, and I like that because you're talking likeliness, right? I mean, we all love certainty. It's great to say this is probable, this is likely, this will happen. It sounds like you're saying, talking about some possibilities and maybe clearly communicating this is not an official forecast. There's still a lot of uncertainty with it, but just tipping off people to give them a little more lead time. Maybe something's possible in the 3, 4, 5 day range out. It sounds like you're saying maybe weather communication, including some of these possibilities, could maybe help people say, hey, we don't maybe need to do a mandatory evacuation right now, but this is something that should be on your radar, right?
Absolutely. And after the tropical conference and getting to really have a little bit more one-on-one time with the folks at the Hurricane Center, these guys are great. They are the best in the business. And so when you see us on air and we're talking about the official forecast from the Hurricane Center, and not disagreeing, but I think what we do on television is the reason why you don't just go to your phone, look at that cone, and leave it at that. We provide more in-depth detail, and while the Hurricane Center gives their detailed discussion, sometimes it may be over the heads of the folks in the lake community. So we try and bring that down a little bit, explain it a little bit more in more understandable terms, but also discuss other possibilities. And I mean, weather is not certain by any means. And we've seen storms and that every model said it was going to do this, all the guidance said it was going to do this. And for whatever reason, post-analysis, it didn't do that. And so there is almost never going to be a certainty with storms. But when you look at models and maybe they keep trending one way, that's when you talk about a high probability, possibility. And that certainly needs to be discussed. And I know one of the speakers at that tropical conference was talking about the best way of of explaining these storms and their potential impact. And he was talking about, why the cone, we need so much more than just the cone. And I agree, we do, but I don't know if that could be answered in just one graphic. I think it needs the broadcast meteorologist
Sure.
to discuss it with multiple graphics, discussing all of the possibilities and all of the potential impacts from the storm. One thing that was fascinating in the post-Ida report is that the Hurricane Center at the end of the report discussed how if the storm had jogged just 15 miles to the east, we would have put a far more strain on our West Bank levee system, and the high likelihood that we would have seen water overtopping those West Bank levees. Now, the Corps of Engineers assures us that even though those levees would have been overtopped, they would have been structurally sound, so they would not have failed. They would have been overtopped. They're designed to be overtopped. They're designed to then, maintain their strength. But it's just interesting that the Hurricane Center says a 15-mile jog, while would have still been an excellent forecast, would have been completely different for parts of Metro New Orleans. So, our levee system, despite what some leaders may say, was not put to the test in Ida. Ida was not a New Orleans storm. We did not feel the brunt. As I said, we did not get hurricane force sustained winds, and we did not see the storm surge that really would have put our levee system to the test. So something that we really tried to emphasize after the storm to folks is that no, Metro New Orleans, you did not survive a Category 4 storm. So for folks that looked at the next major hurricane and say, well, I went through Ida in my house in New Orleans, we were fine, we didn't get anything. That wasn't a test. And what we said before, every storm is completely different.
Chris, that work that you and other broadcast meteorologists are doing, it really helps interpret these storms. How should we think about them, the one we just went through, but also the one in the future, when you can help people see, as bad as that was not hurricane force wind sustained in Metro New Orleans, right? So if a Cat 2 is coming right for New Orleans, don't think, oh, this is like another Ida. It could be substantially worse. It sounds like you can help provide some interpretation for the local population.
And I think that really comes down to probably our most important role. There's the daily forecast that we give you. Is it going to rain on my kid's birthday? Yeah, we do that. But I think it's that interpreting and also building on the information from the one or two graphics that are issued by the National Hurricane Center that we show. But it's the addition of the surge models, the wind forecast models, the just talking of experience of saying, hey, yeah, this isn't just that was a great presentation by Ken Graham, who at the time was director of the National Hurricane Center, that there is no just hurricane or storm out there. Each one can do something completely different.
Sure.
We were talking about Isaac. Isaac was a 1, yet it flooded the river parishes because of the way it made landfall and the speed at which with which it moved. So for folks that flooded in Laplace from Ida wasn't just a Category 1. For so many storms, for Houston, Allison wasn't just a tropical storm. There's no just a type storm, and I think the public is now maybe more aware of that than ever before, with maybe a little bit more how in-depth we get into these discussions.
That's true. I mean, every hurricane, every tropical system is different. We have wind, rain, and the saltwater storm surge, different combinations of each. And like you said, your neighborhood might actually get a worse impact from a tropical storm. That's like a Category 0 hurricane, basically, compared to a higher category system that didn't put the floodwater in your neighborhood. So every storm's different geographical patterns. And that's where the work you're doing, Chris, I think it's really valuable to help interpret this for the local audience to understand what's going to happen in this storm and how is that different from the ones before. So, Chris, I wanted to wrap up by asking you, going into the tropical weather seasons now, what does your engagement look like with your audience? Are you on social media? Are you more on TV? What does the interaction look like? Is it very interactive? How is it different today than maybe back in the times of Hurricane Katrina?
It is completely different. As I said, Katrina, it was the infancy of our website. There was no engagement with the public on our website. We didn't really update manually anything. Our systems would take satellite radar temperature maps, and you could go to view those online, and that was about it. 04, there was no social media. 05, no social media, or it was really in its infancy. As a matter of fact, when I got back to Mobile and having gone to college there, I was able to meet up with friends, And they were the ones that said, "Oh, you got to get on the Facebook." And I went, "What was that?" And they helped me create a Facebook account that I never did anything with for a while. Coming to the 2021 season and even the past several seasons, social media and our website, social media in particular, is sometimes a double-edged sword. It gives us a great outlet for discussing these really in-depth forecasts. I mean, I can go more in-depth online with viewer engagement than I can on air. If we're doing maybe hourly updates on a storm that may be threatening or maybe just of an interest to the public, we may do these extended 5-10 minute weathercasts on air with no public interaction. But then I may take that 10 minutes and then say, "Hey, we're going to cut back to programming, but if you'd like to join us, we're going to go on to Facebook Live and continue the discussion." I may continue that discussion for another hour and a half with folks to where you get just massive amounts of viewer, just those curious and watching from all over the world to those that, as I said, really weather savvy are asking very detailed questions to where then wait, hold on a second. Let me scramble and get over to the vorticity map and show you what I was talking about. People are interested. Let me show you the 500 humidity. And they love that. And so we get to maybe kind of turn hurricane weather nerd a bit here and go back to our days of, college level forecasting when we're doing these detailed briefings for professors where people are fascinated by that. And I think they like seeing that more behind the scenes of what really goes into our forecast. For decades, people have seen what the meteorologist does on television. Once we've done all of our forecasting, condensed those 3-4 hours of work to 3 minutes on air.
The cleaned up version, right?
They see the abbreviated, succinct version of what I've just spent hours doing. But I really think with impactful weather, winter weather, severe weather, tropical weather, they like to see these real detailed forecasts. And I will say, they're a lot more fun to do when I know we are not at risk. If I'm discussing something that looks like it's going to stay over the East Coast, an Atlantic storm, a Caribbean storm, and not impacting us at all, you can kind of take the more scientific approach to the discussion. When it's kind of shifted a bit, when we know we may be impacted by this, we then shift from the meteorology and have to find a kind of a balancing act of the meteorology, but also the impacts, and then the impacts to the populace. A storm that really stands out in my mind is, after seeing what happened to Katrina, again, I still think back on that of being young, naive, and maybe not fully grasping what had happened, to then Hurricane Michael. Category 5, Panama City, I was sent out because Panama City is a big vacation spot for a lot of New Orleanians, so I was sent out there for the landfall of the storm. And this is now, I'm married, older, with 2 kids at home. And you saw these families living in tents. I was there for the landfall, stayed a few days after for some of the beginnings of the recovery. And then we went back a month later. And there were a couple of times that I would need to hold back tears. And you're talking to these families that, young kids, the same age as my kids, living in a tent, because their home was destroyed and not getting the response from emergency officials, from insurance folks to get their lives back on still moving. And so I think these past few storms that I've been able to experience as well, even since Katrina, have given me more of the perspective of the human impact. And that's something I would stress to some of the younger meteorologists who get all excited on social media about another storm and here's where it may be going. And it's like, you need to take a step back and realize that you're forecasting a storm that may change the lives of
that's right,
of your followers, that people that may be following you on Twitter, Facebook, and you're then possibly discussing something that is a life-changing event for them. It goes beyond just the excitement of meteorology at that point.
Chris, I've noticed, living in South Louisiana 8 years and now in Galveston, Texas, the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history happened right in my neighborhood. I've noticed if I can keep things factual, what we're expecting from wind and storm surge, I think some of these, especially younger meteorologists that are coming from different regions, sometimes I've picked up an excitement, or almost they're rooting for a big landfall with big impacts. It's like, you need to come to our neighborhood neighborhoods for a couple weeks or a couple months, and this is going to affect someone's grandma and someone's daughter, right? I mean, these are big life altering storms. So I think that is an advantage of living in these communities that have gone through these things. It's very personal for us. I root every year for the storms to stay out to sea. You know, I'm fascinated by meteorology. I know, and I'm sure you do too. Once you've seen people go through a lot of hardship, and not just storms, right? We've just had a pandemic and financial issues and terrorism and all these other things. People are going through a lot. The last thing they need is a roof off their house. But I think for a lot of us that have experience and live in these areas, I think for us, it helps us shift to be more factual and just, you know, this is what we're looking at. And if anything, we're rooting for low impacts. Chris, you mentioned as far as this being personal for people, do people ever reach out to you with, you know, should I get flood insurance or should I evacuate? Or do people interact on that level with you of asking help on how to make personal decisions? And then how do you handle that?
They do, and you know, it's almost like in the beginning I can handle a few, you know, half dozen individual what should I do type questions, and you are able to maybe get a little bit more in depth to, hey, I'm in this neighborhood and I don't know what I should do, and I could tell them, hey, look, you're on high ground. If you're comfortable with, you know, possibly weeks of no power, you have food and water, you're comfortable with the forecast, then by all means stay. You know, it's an expensive, you know, I don't
Sure.
recommend that everybody leave for all storms.
Sure.
It is an expensive task, and it's draining. I mean, there are elderly and those, you know, kind of at risk that cannot survive for 10 plus hours on the road.
Very stressful. Evacuations.
It is a very stressful time. And so I kind of advise, look, if you have these set of criteria, you're comfortable with the forecast, you are on high ground, you don't think the wind is going to be a major issue in terms of trees around your property. We have a lot of areas on the North Shore with pine trees that snap in a good breeze and can come right onto your home. You have the ability to have power in your home, or you're comfortable without, then by all means stay. Now, of course, areas along the coastline, there are areas that you're going to have to leave every time no matter what. But I kind of advise, no, you don't have to leave. Or I advise, yeah, you know what? My family is in that same part of town and I've told them to leave. I don't know if I necessarily want to take on the responsibility of, well, Chris Franklin told us we didn't have to evacuate. So all I can do is, as you said, give them the factual information that here's what you could see in terms of impacts. If you're fine with that, then you make that decision. However, I'm advising my family to leave. I can't leave, but I'm telling them to go. And, you know, where we are in Jefferson Parish now, we're high ground. We really don't have any trees that would have been a major issue. I think we would have been fine structurally, and thank goodness our home was structurally fine. But I have 2 young kids. I knew if we lost power, first off, I really can't come home for a few days. And 2, I don't want to have my wife in a hot house with 2 kids bored out of their minds. So it was more of a, no, as far as the kids go, you need to leave with them. And so I advised that. I said, look, I got 2 young kids. If you have young kids, older parents, older adults living in your home, or those that just need, you know, they're on oxygen or they have to have electricity, no, you need to go.
Chris, I really like that approach because you're not telling people what to do, but you're arming them with information and helping them think through some possibilities. Like you said, there might be even 2 people on the same street. You know, one is caring for their elderly grandfather who's on oxygen. Losing power can be a huge issue, but then maybe you have a college student who says, hey, I can eat canned tuna fish for a couple days. You know, it seems like you're arming people with information. And I've noticed, I feel like people usually make the best choice for themselves and their family if they're making an informed decision.
Right. And, you know, one thing that was different from Katrina is that for many storms, after a couple of days of no power, you can then make the decision, hey, you know what, this is pretty uncomfortable. Our energy officials, Entergy here, is saying it may be another couple of weeks before we get power back on. I'm going to leave now. Well, with Katrina, obviously with the flooding, that wasn't an option. So we do discuss that as a possibility that, hey, look, if the flooding becomes more of an issue. Now, thankfully, Ida never really looked like it was going to be a surge and flooding from Gulf saltwater intrusion as much as other storms. So that was never really much of a worry. So we did say, look, if it gets uncomfortable after a few days, you probably will still be able to leave if you need to. But obviously with Katrina, that was not the case, which is why, we have to treat every storm differently. Cat 5 Hurricane Michael in Panama City, just because of their terrain, flooding, and because of how fast it developed, surge wasn't much of an issue for them. So it was kind of the same thing. If you think you're in an area that you want to ride it out, then by all means ride it out. But if you realize after a couple of days it's miserable, at least you do have the ability to leave. However, with that said, New Orleans is a city surrounded by water. There's always a possibility of some of our exit routes of going under or sustaining damage to where that suddenly isn't a possibility. Heck, after Katrina, the twin span failed and the causeway went underwater. We kind of lost a couple of our routes to even leave the city had you stayed.
Chris, what about a rapidly intensifying hurricane 80 miles east of where Ida tracked? Something like that, where it is a big hit on New Orleans, but again, you don't have the 72-hour lead time.
It's one of those. That's when it's the remain in place. This is why we advise to having supplies at your home ready to go for the entirety of a hurricane season, to where, hey, look, if you can get out, you might have a few hour window. After that, you're better off just remaining in place and having the supplies that you need. Obviously, one major expense is getting these whole home generators. They're great to have, but we do reports all the time about these generators and how many folks die from carbon monoxide or just not using the generators properly. So while they can be life-saving for folks that need the power or just the comfort of having some electricity, they too are very dangerous. And so, we treat every storm completely different. The areas to evacuate to, I do a map and I say where to go. Each storm is going to have different evacuation points. So something I stress is have an idea of kind of north, west, and east of where you could go in a storm, because there may be routes north and west just based on the track of a storm that those are off limits right now. Your best bet is going east. With Ida, I told my family, go to the Florida beaches. They're like, really? And I said, Florida beaches will be fine. As a matter of fact, they were a little bit beyond Destin. The kids were able to play in a pool the day Ida was making landfall. To them, it was nothing going on. They were fine. And so at least having a basic plan is probably the least you can do in preparation for hurricane season. And then it's just that personal responsibility of, I'm going to give you all the facts, as you said, armed with the facts to then make that decision, which is best for you and those that you may be taking care of.
Yeah, and like you said, having supplies so that you're not having to go to the store the day before, or as the rush is on for water and food. And because like you said, some storms you're going to probably shelter in place, other ones you're going to evac. There may be multiple evacuation possibilities. It sounds like you're on the air trying to help guide people the best you can into these different possibilities.
And that window becomes small, or the number of options maybe becomes smaller when you have these rapidly intensifying.
Sure.
And you don't have the days notice,
less options.
We're not tracking a storm necessarily off the African coast for the last 2 weeks, and we know exactly where it's going, and you've had plenty of lead time.
That's right.
The ones that just spin up in the Caribbean or the Gulf, or just off the east coast of Florida like Katrina, we don't really get that massive lead time that people think we're going to have.
Chris, really appreciate you coming on the GeoTrek podcast. Are there any last thoughts you'd like to share just on hurricane preparedness? What you want people to, one last thought to take home as we go into the heart of this hurricane season?
Yeah, well, I guess as far as this season goes, it's been quiet. I've done a few talks back to early July that I had a graphic where I listed the 3 storms that we've had so far this season, talking about how they were all shorties, less than 48 hours. And knowing I had a few other talks coming up, and thought, I'm going to have to update that graphic before my next talk. And here we are mid-August, and I haven't had to do anything to that graphic. We're still the same in terms of our numbers as we were in early July. That does not bode for a quiet season. And as we know, if we saw 4 storms this season, the 3 that we've had and one more, but that one more became a 5 in the Gulf and hits Houston, Texas, 2022 was a substantial and significant year for hurricanes. It only takes that one. So even with these lulls, even with the slow season, that's why I'm never a huge fan of the seasonal forecast. While they have their place, you look at 2019, very active season. U.S. was almost not impacted at all. It was minimal. Then you have the seasons of 2021, 2022, or 2020, 2021 that were obviously very impactful, especially to Southeast Louisiana. But then you look back in history, the season 92 with Andrew, that was a slow season. You look back at some of the other major impactful storms that happened in slow seasons, to where just because a season has this lull, or we're expecting it to be below average, I think your awareness and your preparation needs to be the same each and every season, which is why, if we ever get a below average season forecast again, hopefully soon, I don't want that to be all clear the season, go ahead and don't worry about anything, because we're not expecting that many storms. It only takes one. And I think it's become kind of cliche, but I think it's still very important to stress of as far as the tropical threats, it only takes one. Obviously with 2019 and or 2020, 2021, it only takes like 8 or 9 threats that we had here that it was just miserable. But, it just takes that one to completely ruin your year.
Chris, that's a great reminder. 92 is such a great example. Andrew was such a high impact storm coming in really the southern part of Miami as a Cat 5, then over to Louisiana. But that was the A storm in late August, right?
Yeah, it was the first storm in a slow season that had a slow start.
Right.
But that was the first storm. And you look at the impact of Betsy and Camille. Those were the second and third storms of the season. That was still early in the season itself, as far as the names go. So it doesn't take the late letters that can be the powerhouses. It can be these early season, the first storms that become the life-changing storms.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good reminder. We have to stay vigilant, have to stay prepared. And like you said, it only takes one. Well, I'm hoping this year, I know Louisiana's had so many impacts in the recent years. I'm really hoping you all get a break. I hope all of the U.S. gets a break. We'll just have to watch and see, but just appreciate the good work you're doing. I know the folks there in South Louisiana appreciate it too. And I'll be following you through this hurricane season. And I just really appreciate you coming on the podcast. You provided us with a lot of great insights, education, and some of these amazing stories of what you've lived through.
Hal, I appreciate it. I think this far removed from Katrina, it doesn't bring back too many memories. There's actually a show on Apple TV, 5 Days of Memorial, about what happened at the Memorial Hospital. And folks have said, "Oh, can you?" I said, "I don't know if I can watch it. I don't know if I can truly relive some of that." But looking back on some of the stories, if we can learn from it, it's a little easier to share. But some of those more just devastating type stories from Katrina are still, even this far removed, kind of hard to relive and kind of bring back a little bit of PTSD, not the extent of what some folks went through, but it certainly is still a harsh reminder for folks here.